Young schoolteacher opened her classroom door and found her brother branded as an outlaw. She opened her schoolhouse door, expecting another quiet morning of teaching children their letters, but instead found her brother slumped against her desk, blood on his shirt, and a wanted poster with his face crumpled in his trembling hands. The brother she thought was dead for 5 years now stood before her as a branded outlaw and killer. In 15 minutes, innocent children would walk through that door, trusting her to keep them safe. But how do you choose between the law you've sworn to follow and the blood that runs through your veins? The sun had barely touched the edge of the horizon when Mary Catherine walked across the dusty main street toward her schoolhouse. Her boots made soft sounds against the hard-packed earth, and the air still held the coolness of night. She carried her lunch pail in one hand and her worn leather satchel in the other, filled with the day's lessons and a small bundle of wildflowers she had picked at dawn. The town of Cedar Ridge was just beginning to stir. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster called to the morning. Mary Catherine loved this quiet time before the children arrived, when the world felt clean and full of promise. She had been teaching here for 3 years now, ever since she turned 21 and answered the advertisement in the territorial newspaper. The work was hard, but it filled her heart in ways that nothing else ever had. She reached into her pocket for the heavy brass key and turned it in the schoolhouse door. The hinges creaked as she pushed it open, as she stepped inside, breathing in the familiar smell of chalk dust and old wood. The morning light slanted through the windows, painting golden squares on the wooden floor where her students would soon sit with their slates and primers. Mary Catherine set her things on the desk and turned toward the windows to let in the fresh air. That was when she saw him. A man sat slumped in the corner beside her desk, his back against the wall and his head hanging low. His clothes were dusty and torn, and there was something dark stained across the front of his shirt. At first, her heart jumped with fear. Drifters sometimes wandered into town, and not all of them were friendly. But something about the way he sat, something about the shape of his shoulders, made her look closer. The man raised his head slowly, and Mary Catherine's world tilted sideways. "Hello, Mary Cat," he said in a voice that she had not heard in 5 long years. "Thomas." Her brother Thomas, who had left home when she was 19 to seek his fortune in the gold fields of Colorado. Thomas, who had written her 3 letters and then disappeared like smoke on the wind. Thomas, who she had mourned as surely dead, killed by claim jumpers or disease or the 100 other dangers that swallowed young men in the territories. But this was not the brother she remembered. That Thomas had been 23 and full of dreams, with quick hands and a quicker smile. This man looked older than his 28 years. His face was thin and weathered, and his eyes held shadows that had not been there before. The dark stain on his shirt was blood, she realized, and his left hand was wrapped in a dirty bandage. "Thomas," she whispered, and the word came out like a prayer. He tried to smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "I know I should not be here," he said, "but I had nowhere else to go." Mary Catherine dropped her satchel and moved toward him, her hands reaching out like she might touch him to make sure he was real. But then she stopped because she saw what he held in his right hand. It was a piece of paper, crumpled and worn, with printing across the top and a picture that looked like his face. A wanted poster. Thomas saw her looking and held it up so she could read it clearly. $500, he said, his voice bitter as coffee grounds. "That is what they say I am worth, dead or alive." Mary Catherine read the words printed beneath his picture. Thomas Michael Bray, wanted for cattle theft and murder. Armed and dangerous. She read them twice, but they did not make sense. This was Thomas, who had taught her to braid wildflowers into crowns when she was small. Thomas, who had held her when their parents died of fever and promised that everything would be all right. Thomas, who could not kill a wounded bird, much less a man. "It is not true," she said, and it was not a question. "No," he said quietly, "but try telling that to Sheriff Morrison or the territorial judge. They have their minds made up, and a dead man cannot speak for himself." The blood on his shirt was dry and brown, and she could see that he was hurt worse than just a bandaged hand. There was pain in the way he held himself, and his breathing was shallow and careful. "You are bleeding," she said. "It is nothing I cannot handle. But Mary Cat, you need to understand something. In about 10 minutes, those children of yours are going to start arriving. And if anyone sees me here, if anyone knows you helped me, you will lose everything. This job, this life you have built for yourself. They will say you are helping a criminal." Mary Catherine looked toward the windows, where the morning light was growing stronger. He was right. Soon she would hear the sound of children's voices and running feet, and her quiet world would fill with lessons and laughter and all the small joys that made her days worthwhile. Little Sarah Peterson would bring her a new flower for her desk. Billy Crawford would show her his sums, proud of the neat columns he had learned to make. Emma Walsh would read from her primer in her careful, halting voice. They were counting on her to be there, to be the same Miss O'Brien they trusted and loved. But how could she teach them about honesty and goodness when her own brother sat before her, wanted for crimes she knew he could not have committed? How could she ring the morning bell and pretend that nothing had changed? "Why did you come here?" she asked. Thomas looked down at his hands, at the wanted poster that had become as familiar as his own shadow. "Because I remembered what you used to say when we were children. You said that when people were lost, they should follow the sound of the school bell, that it would always lead them home." Outside, Mary Catherine could hear the first sounds of the town waking up in earnest. A door slammed somewhere down the street. A horse whinnied in the stable behind Murphy's store. And in the distance, growing closer, she could hear what she had been dreading, the high, clear voices of children walking to school. The brass bell sat on her desk, waiting for her to ring it as she did every morning at 8 o'clock sharp. But today, the weight of it in her hands would be different. Today, it would not be calling children to learn their letters and numbers. Today, it would be tolling for the end of everything she thought she knew about right and wrong, about family and duty, about the simple life she had built in this dusty frontier town. Thomas was watching her face, reading the struggle there like words on a page. "I can go," he said quietly. "I can walk out that door right now and never come back. You do not have to choose." But Mary Catherine knew that he was wrong. She had already chosen the moment she recognized his voice calling her by the childhood name only he had ever used. The children were almost at her door, and in a few minutes she would have to decide what kind of teacher, what kind of sister she really was. Mary Catherine moved faster than she had ever moved in her life. The voices of children were getting closer, and Thomas could barely stand without swaying. She grabbed his good arm and pulled him toward the back of the schoolroom, where a narrow door led to the cellar beneath the building. "Down there," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "There are old supplies stored below. You can hide behind the crates." Thomas looked at the dark opening and then back at her face. "Mary Cat, if they find me here, they will not," she said, though her heart was beating so hard she could barely hear her own words. "But you must be completely silent. Do you understand? Not a sound, no matter what happens up here." He nodded and started down the wooden steps, each one creaking softly under his weight. Mary Catherine watched him disappear into the shadows below, then closed the door and pushed her desk in front of it. The heavy oak would scraped against the floor, but it looked natural enough. Just Miss O'Brien rearranging her classroom, as teachers sometimes did. The front door burst open, and Sarah Peterson ran inside, her blonde braids flying behind her. She was 8 years old, and always the first to arrive, clutching a small bouquet of prairie grass and late summer flowers. "Good morning, Miss O'Brien," she called out in her bright voice. "I brought you flowers for your desk." "Thank you, Sarah," Mary Catherine said, taking the flowers with hands that she hoped were not shaking. "They are beautiful." More children began arriving. Billy Crawford and his younger sister Lucy came through the door together, followed by the Walsh twins and old Mrs. Henderson's grandson, Peter. Soon the room was full of the sounds Mary Catherine loved most. Children hanging up their coats, opening their lunch pails to peek at what their mothers had packed, chattering about the morning's adventures on their walk to school. She rang the brass bell, and they all found their seats. 23 children in all, ranging from 6-year-old Lucy Crawford to 14-year-old James Murphy, who would probably leave school after this year to help his father at the store. Today we will begin with arithmetic, Mary Catherine announced, walking to the blackboard. Her voice sounded normal to her ears, but inside, every word felt like it was being pulled from a deep well. Please open your slates and copy the problems I am writing on the board. She wrote numbers with chalk, drawing the symbols carefully while her mind raced. Below her feet, separated by only a few inches of wooden planks and the thin rug she stood on, her brother sat in darkness. Thomas, who had once helped her with her own arithmetic when she was small. Thomas, who was now wanted for murder. The children worked quietly, their slate pencils scratching against the smooth stone. Mary Catherine walked between the rows, checking their work and offering gentle corrections, but her attention kept drifting to the floor. Was Thomas comfortable? Was his bleeding getting worse? Could the children hear anything from below? At 10 o'clock, she dismissed them for morning recess. The children ran outside into the bright sunshine, their voices carrying back through the open windows as they played tag and jumped rope in the schoolyard. Mary Catherine waited until she was sure they were all occupied, then moved her desk and opened the cellar door. "Thomas," she whispered into the darkness. "I am here," came his voice from somewhere among the storage crates. She climbed down the steps, carrying a cup of water from the pitcher on her desk. The cellar was cool and dim, smelling of old wood and dry earth. Thomas sat propped against a wooden crate, his face pale but alert. "How are you?" she asked, kneeling beside him and offering the water. He drank gratefully, then looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than they had been that morning. "I can hear them," he said quietly. "The children. They sound happy. They're good children," Mary Catherine said. "They deserve better than to have their schoolhouse turned into a hiding place for wanted." Thomas flinched at her words, but she did not soften them. She needed to understand what had happened to him, what had turned her brother into someone who carried wanted posters with his face on them. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me what really happened." He was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sound of children playing above their heads. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with things he wished he could forget. "I was working for the Hartwell Ranch," he said. "Been there 8 months, helping with their cattle drives. Good work, good pay. But there were things happening that did not sit right with me. Cattle going missing from neighboring spreads, ending up with fresh Hartwell brands. When I asked questions, they told me to mind my own business." Mary Catherine felt her stomach tighten. "What did you do?" "Why should I have done from the start? I quit. But Marcus Hartwell, the owner's son, said I knew too much to just walk away. Said I was part of it whether I liked it or not." Thomas shifted against the crate, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. 3 nights ago, they came for me. Said I was going to take the blame for all of it. Said a drifter like me was perfect for the job because nobody would miss me if I disappeared. But you got away. I tried to. But Hartwell's foreman, a man named Jake Morrison, he came at me with a gun. I had no choice, Mary Cat. It was him or me. Thomas looked down at his bandaged hand. I killed him, but not the way they are saying. It was not murder. It was staying alive. The sound of the school bell came from above, calling the children back inside. Mary Catherine knew she had to go, but she could not make herself move. Her brother, the boy who had read her bedtime stories and taught her to whistle, had killed a man. Even if it was self-defense, even if he had no choice, the law would not see it that way. The law only saw what was written on that wanted poster. Thomas Michael O'Brien, murderer. I have to go back up, she said. I know. And Mary Cat. He reached out and touched her hand with his good one. I am sorry. For all of it. For bringing this to your door. For putting you in danger. For not being the brother you deserved. She climbed back up the steps and closed the door behind her, moving her desk back into place, just as the first children began coming through the front door. The afternoon passed like a strange dream. She taught spelling and geography, listened to reading recitations, and helped little Lucy Crawford with her letters. But part of her attention was always focused on the floor beneath her feet, on the man hiding in the darkness below. Near the end of the day, she heard heavy footsteps on the front porch. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Morrison approaching the door. He was a large man with graying hair and a star pinned to his vest, and he had always been kind to her in the past. But today, the sight of him made her mouth go dry. He knocked on the doorframe and stepped inside, removing his hat. "Afternoon, Miss O'Brien." "Children." "Good afternoon, Sheriff Morrison," Mary Catherine said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "What brings you by today?" "Just making my rounds, checking on folks. We have had word of a dangerous man in the area, wanted for cattle theft and murder. I want to make sure you're being careful, especially being out here alone with the children." "Of course," she said. "What does he look like?" Sheriff Morrison reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded paper. Mary Catherine's heart nearly stopped when she recognized it as the same wanted poster Thomas had shown her that morning. "Name is Thomas O'Brien," the sheriff said, unfolding the paper. "About 28 years old, brown hair, green eyes. Armed and dangerous. If you see anyone matching this description, you send word to me immediately. Do not try to handle it yourself." Mary Catherine looked at the poster, at the picture that was unmistakably her brother's face. She felt the children watching her, waiting for her response, trusting her to keep them safe. Below her feet, she knew Thomas was listening to every word, knowing that his own sister was looking at his face on a wanted poster and being asked to turn him in. "I will be careful, Sheriff," she said. "Thank you for the warning." He folded the poster and put it back in his pocket. "You are a good teacher, Miss O'Brien. These children are lucky to have you. Just remember, sometimes the people we think we can trust turn out to be the most dangerous of all." The sheriff's boots echoed across the wooden floor as he walked back to the door. Each step seemed to press down on the very spot where Thomas was hiding, as if the weight of the law itself was searching. Mary Catherine watched through the window as Sheriff Morrison mounted his horse and rode back toward town, and she realized that her simple choice between family and duty had become something much more complicated. The blood that ran through her veins was the same blood that ran through Thomas's, but it was also the blood that would mark them both as outlaws if anyone discovered the truth. The last child had gone home an hour ago, and the schoolhouse stood empty except for the shadows that gathered in its corners. Mary Catherine sat at her desk, watching the sun sink toward the horizon through the western window. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the same colors that had filled countless evenings of her childhood when she and Thomas would sit on the porch of their family's small farm, watching the day end. She had sent little Sarah Peterson home with a message for Mrs. Henderson, saying that Miss O'Brien would be staying late to prepare lessons and would not need dinner brought over tonight. It was a lie, but a small one compared to the larger deception she was living. The town had grown used to her independent ways over the past 3 years. They would not question a hardworking teacher burning the midnight oil. When she was certain that no one would come looking for her, Mary Catherine lit a candle and gathered the food she had saved from her lunch. Half a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, and an apple that was only slightly bruised. She added a jar of water and a clean cloth from her supplies, then moved the desk away from the cellar door. The hinges creaked as she opened it, and the candlelight flickered down into the darkness below. "Thomas," she called softly, "I am here." She descended the wooden steps carefully, holding the candle high to light her way. Thomas sat where she had left him, propped against the same wooden crate, but he looked worse than he had that afternoon. His face was pale, and there were lines of pain around his eyes that had not been there before. "You are hurt worse than you said," she observed, setting the food and water beside him. "It is nothing that will not heal," he said, but his voice was weaker than it had been that morning. Mary Catherine knelt beside him and held the candle close to examine the bloodstain on his shirt. "Let me see." Thomas hesitated, then unbuttoned his shirt with clumsy fingers. Beneath the fabric, Mary Catherine could see a long gash across his ribs, partially healed but still angry and red around the edges. Someone had tried to stitch it closed, but the work was rough and some of the stitches had torn loose. "Who did this?" she asked. "A doctor in Millerville, 2 towns over. Paid him what I could, but he was drunk and his hands were not steady. Thomas tried to smile. I have had worse. Mary Catherine dampened the clean cloth with water and began to carefully clean around the wound. Thomas winced, but did not pull away. In the flickering candlelight, she could see other scars on his chest and arms, marks that had not been there when he left home 5 years ago. The frontier had written its story across his body in lines of pain and survival. "What happened to you out there?" she asked quietly, dabbing at the torn stitches. "What happened to the brother I knew?" Thomas was silent for a long time, staring up at the wooden beams that supported the schoolhouse floor above them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and miles and choices that could not be undone. "I was young when I left," he said, 19 years old and full of dreams about striking it rich in the gold fields. "I thought I would be gone for a year, maybe 2. Come back with enough money to buy us a better farm, maybe send you to that teaching college back east you always talked about. But you never found gold." "Oh, I found some. Not much, but enough to keep hope alive. Enough to keep me digging in streams that never gave up their secrets. Enough to keep me moving from camp to camp, chasing rumors and stories." He shifted against the crate, and Mary Catherine saw him bite back a sound of pain. "But the gold was not the problem. The problem was what the searching did to me." Mary Catherine continued, cleaning his wound, her hands gentle and sure. She had tended injuries before, when children fell in the schoolyard, or when Mrs. Patterson had cut herself badly while helping prepare the schoolhouse for the winter. "Tell me," she said. "The camps were rough places, Mary Cat. Full of desperate men doing desperate things. You learned to fight, or you did not survive. You learned to sleep with one eye open and your hand on your gun. You learned that trust was a luxury that could get you killed." Thomas watched her face in the candlelight. "I told myself I was just becoming stronger, tougher. But somewhere along the way, I became someone I did not recognize." He reached into his shirt pocket with his good hand and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Mary Catherine recognized it immediately. A picture of their parents that had been taken the year before they died, with 7-year-old Mary Catherine standing between them and 12-year-old Thomas at his father's shoulder. "I carried this everywhere," Thomas said, holding the photograph so she could see it. "Every mining camp, every cattle drive, every town where I tried to start fresh. I would look at it and remember what I was working toward, remember what home looked like." Mary Catherine felt tears gathering in her eyes, but she blinked them away. There would be time for crying later. Right now, Thomas needed her to be strong. "Why did you stop writing?" she asked. 3 letters in 5 years, and then nothing. "I thought you were dead." "Because I was ashamed," he said simply. "Each year that passed without me coming home, without me making the fortune I had promised, I felt like more of a failure. What was I supposed to tell you? That your big brother was still digging in creeks and sleeping in the rain? That he was no closer to his dreams than when he left?" Mary Catherine finished cleaning his wound and began to tear the clean cloth into strips for fresh bandages. "You could have told me that you were alive," she said. "That would have been enough. I kept meaning to. Kept telling myself that next month, next year, I would have something good to write about. But the months turned into years, and the years turned into this." He gestured to the wanted poster that still lay crumpled on the floor beside him. The candle had burned down to half its length, and wax dripped slowly onto the dirt floor of the cellar. Above them, the schoolhouse creaked and settled in the evening breeze. Mary Catherine could smell the familiar scents of her workplace: chalk dust and old wood, the faint sweetness of the wildflowers that Sarah Peterson had brought that morning, the mustiness of books that had been read by countless small hands. "I used to read to you," Thomas said suddenly, "when you were small and could not sleep. Do you remember?" Mary Catherine smiled, the first real smile she had worn all day. "Robinson Crusoe," she said, "and Treasure Island. You would read until I fell asleep, and sometimes I would pretend to be asleep longer than I was because I wanted to hear more of the story." I remember. Without thinking, Mary Catherine reached for her satchel and pulled out one of the books she used with her older students. It was a collection of stories and poems, worn soft from years of use. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked. Thomas nodded, and she opened the book to a story she knew by heart. By the light of the flickering candle, in the cellar that had become his hiding place, Mary Catherine read to her brother as she had not done since they were children. Her voice was soft and steady, and the familiar words filled the small space like a blessing. She read about brave knights and distant lands, about heroes who faced impossible odds and found ways to triumph. She read about honor and courage and the price of doing what was right, even when the cost was high. And as she read, she watched Thomas's face relax for the first time since she had found him that morning. For a moment, he looked like the brother she remembered, young and hopeful and full of dreams. When she finished the story, the candle had burned down to a stub, and the air in the cellar was thick with melted wax and the weight of shared memories. Thomas had closed his eyes, but she could tell he was not sleeping. "Mary Cat," he said quietly, "I know what I'm asking of you by being here. I know what it could cost you if anyone finds out. But I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to bring danger to your door." "I know," she said, "and I need you to know that if staying here puts you at risk, I will leave. Tonight, if you ask me to, I will walk out that door and never look back, and you can go on with your life like none of this ever happened." Mary Catherine looked at her brother's face in the dying candlelight. She thought about the children who would arrive at her schoolhouse in a few hours, trusting her to teach them and keep them safe. She thought about Sheriff Morrison and his warning about dangerous men. She thought about the life she had built for herself in Cedar Ridge, solid and respectable and peaceful. Then she thought about the photograph Thomas carried, about the promises she had made to their parents before they died, about the bond of blood that connected her to this man who had lost his way but had never stopped trying to find his way home. "Tomorrow," she said, blowing out the candle and plunging them into darkness, "we are going to find a way to clear your name." In the black silence of the cellar, she heard Thomas draw in a sharp breath, but she could not tell if it was from pain or from hope, and perhaps, in the end, there was no difference between the two. Mary Catherine woke before dawn, though she had barely slept. The schoolhouse was cold and quiet around her, and for a moment she forgot why she had spent the night there instead of in her small room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Then she remembered Thomas was still hidden in the cellar below, and today she would have to decide what kind of woman she truly was. She lit a candle and made her way down to the cellar. Thomas was awake, sitting against the wooden crate with his eyes fixed on the stairs. His color was better than it had been the night before, and the fresh bandages she had applied seemed to be helping. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Is it?" he asked. Mary Catherine set the candle on a nearby crate and sat down across from him. In the flickering light, she could see that he had been thinking through the long hours of the night, just as she had. His face carried the weight of difficult decisions. "Thomas," she said, "show me the evidence you mentioned. The proof that Marcus Hartwell and his men were stealing cattle." Thomas reached into his saddlebags, which he had managed to bring with him when he fled to the schoolhouse. From inside, he pulled out a leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting, and a small canvas pouch. "I kept records," he said, opening the journal. "Every drive I went on, every herd that came through with fresh brands that did not match the bills of sale. Every conversation I overheard about which ranches to hit next." He handed her the journal. "I was not the only one who knew what was happening, but I was the only one who wrote it down." Mary Catherine read through several pages by candlelight. Thomas had been thorough, recording dates and locations, names and numbers of cattle, descriptions of brands that had been changed. It was damning evidence, but it was also the word of a wanted man against respected ranchers. "And this?" she asked, pointing to the canvas pouch. Thomas opened it to reveal several pieces of metal, each about the size of a silver dollar. Mary Catherine did not recognize them at first, but as she looked closer, she could see that they were branding irons, miniature versions of the tools used to mark cattle. "Every ranch has its own brand," Thomas explained, "but these are special. They are designed to change one brand into another. You heat them up and press them over the original mark, turning a bar T into a circle H, or a lazy S into a double R. Marcus Hartwell had a whole collection of them, for every ranch within 50 miles. Mary Catherine stared at the small irons. They were proof of guilt, but they were also proof that her brother had stolen them when he fled. In the eyes of the law, Thomas was still a thief, even if what he had stolen was evidence of a larger crime. "We have to take this to Sheriff Morrison," she said. Thomas shook his head. "He will not believe me. Mary Cat, I am a wanted man. My word means nothing against theirs, evidence or no evidence." "Then we do not go alone," Mary Catherine said, her mind working through the possibilities. "We go together. All of us. You, me, Sheriff Morrison, and Marcus Hartwell. We meet in the open, in front of the whole town if necessary, and we let the truth speak for itself." "That is suicide," Thomas said. "Hartwell has men with him, armed men. The moment they see me, they will start shooting." Mary Catherine was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Above them, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep through the schoolhouse windows. In a few hours, children would be walking to school, expecting their teacher to be there with lessons and smiles and the steady comfort of routine. But some lessons, Mary Catherine realized, could not be taught from books. "Get dressed," she said, standing up. "We're going to town." "Mary Cat, trust me," she said, "the way I trusted you when you used to read to me in the dark." An hour later, Mary Catherine rode down the main street of Cedar Ridge on the old mare she borrowed from Mrs. Henderson's stable. Beside her, Thomas sat straight in the saddle despite his injuries, his hat pulled low over his face. The wanted poster in Sheriff Morrison's pocket might bear his likeness, but 5 years and hard living had changed him enough that a casual observer might not make the connection. The sun was just coming up over the eastern hills, and the town was beginning to wake. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the first early risers were moving about their business. Mary Catherine could see Sheriff Morrison's office up ahead, a lamp burning in the window. She dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and tied her horse to the hitching post. Thomas remained mounted, his hand resting casually near his gun. They had agreed that he would stay outside unless Mary Catherine called for him. The sheriff looked up in surprise when she entered his office. "Miss O'Brien? What brings you out so early?" "I need to send a message to the Hartwell Ranch," she said. "Tell Marcus Hartwell that I have something that belongs to him, and I would like to return it. Ask him to meet me in the street outside your office at 8 o'clock. Sheriff Morrison frowned. "What kind of something?" "Evidence," Mary Catherine said simply. "Evidence that will interest him very much." The sheriff studied her face for a long moment. Mary Catherine had always been known as a sensible woman, not given to dramatics or mysterious behavior. If she said she had evidence about something, it was worth investigating. "I will send a message," he said. "But Miss O'Brien, if this is about anything dangerous, it is about justice," she said. "That is your business, is it not, Sheriff?" By 8 o'clock, a small crowd had gathered in the street outside the sheriff's office. Word had spread quickly through the town, as word always did in small places, that something important was happening. Mary Catherine stood in the dusty street, still wearing her plain brown dress and sensible boots, but holding Thomas's leather journal in her hands like a weapon. Marcus Hartwell arrived with 3 of his men, all of them armed. He was a tall man with graying hair and expensive clothes, the kind of man who was used to getting his way through money and influence. When he saw Mary Catherine standing alone in the street, he smiled. "Miss O'Brien," he said, dismounting from his horse, "I understand you have something of mine." "I do," she said, holding up the journal. "Evidence that you and your men have been stealing cattle from every ranch in this territory for the better part of 2 years. Hartwell's smile disappeared. "That is a serious accusation, Mississippi. I hope you have proof to back it up." "Thomas," Mary Catherine called. Thomas rode out from where he had been waiting in the shadow of Murphy's store. "If I had murdered him in cold blood, as they claim, the bullet would have come from behind." Sheriff Morrison took the letter and read it carefully. When he finished, he looked at Hartwell with new eyes. "Marcus," he said, I think you and I need to have a long talk." The confrontation ended not with gunfire, as Mary Catherine had feared, but with handcuffs. Marcus Hartwell and his men were arrested on charges of cattle theft and conspiracy. Thomas was cleared of murder charges, though he would still have to stand trial for his part in the cattle operation. The evidence was clear enough that most people believed he had been trying to stop the theft, not participate in it. But the victory came with a cost. Mary Catherine's involvement in hiding a wanted man, even a man who turned out to be innocent, had consequences. The Territorial Education Board decided that her judgment was too questionable for her to continue teaching children. She was dismissed from her position, effective immediately. 3 days later, Mary Catherine stood in her empty schoolhouse for the last time. The children's desks were still arranged in neat rows, and the blackboard still held the arithmetic problems she had written there on the morning when everything changed. Her few personal belongings were packed in a small trunk, ready to be loaded onto the stage that would take her to the next town, where she hoped to find another teaching position. Thomas had offered to take her with him to California, where he planned to start fresh, but Mary Catherine had declined. She was not ready to run away, and she was not ready to give up on teaching. Somewhere in some other frontier town, children needed someone to teach them their letters and numbers. Someone to read them stories and show them that learning could be an adventure. She picked up the brass bell from her desk, the same bell that had called children to school for 3 years, the same bell that had tolled like a funeral drum on the morning when her old life ended. It was hers to keep, a gift from the school board when she first arrived in Cedar Ridge. Mary Catherine walked to the front door of the schoolhouse and stepped outside into the morning sunlight. The town was quiet, and most people were going about their business as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, at least for her. She lifted the brass bell and rang it one final time, letting the clear, sweet sound carry across the dusty street and out toward the horizon where a future waited, uncertain but not without hope. Sometimes, Mary Catherine thought as she walked toward the stage depot, the most important lessons were not about arithmetic or geography or proper penmanship. Sometimes they were about the choices people made when everything they believed was tested, about the courage it took to stand up for family, even when the cost was high, about the difference between law and justice, and about the truth that love was often more complicated than the simple stories found in children's books. The brass bell grew silent in her hands, but its echo lingered in the morning air, a reminder that some sounds, once heard, could never quite be forgotten. Someone to read them stories and show them that learning could be an adventure. She picked up the brass bell from her desk, the same bell that had called children to school for 3 years, the same bell that had tolled like a funeral drum on the morning when her old life ended. It was hers to keep, a gift from the school board when she first arrived in Cedar Ridge. Mary Catherine walked to the front door of the schoolhouse and stepped outside into the morning sunlight. The town was quiet, and most people were going about their business as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, at least for her. She lifted the brass bell and rang it one final time, letting the clear, sweet sound carry across the dusty street and out toward the horizon where a future waited, uncertain but not without hope. Sometimes, Mary Catherine thought as she walked toward the stage depot, the most important lessons were not about arithmetic or geography or proper penmanship. Sometimes they were about the choices people made when everything they believed was tested, about the courage it took to stand up for family, even when the cost was high, about the difference between law and justice, and about the truth that love was often more complicated than the simple stories found in children's books. The brass bell grew silent in her hands, but its echo lingered in the morning air, a reminder that some sounds, once heard, could never quite be forgotten. The brass bell grew silent in her hands, but its echo lingered in the morning air, a reminder that some sounds, once heard, could never quite be forgotten.